15.
And the huge problem about coming on stage after having 15 minutes about Coco Chanel is you end up feeling really self-conscious about what you're wearing. And I'd just like to say, charity shop, and that was my granddad's. There are a couple of similarities. I'm going to talk more or less about the same century. I have no pictures, so I'm sorry to say you have to look at me. I have notes. There you go. There's some notes. Hopefully you can't read those, which gives a bit of difference between me and you and leaves me with something to say. And I think this is absolutely marvelous. Does this egg timer actually count 15 minutes? Isn't that fantastic? I've got 15 minutes. Look, I've still got 15 minutes. Still got 15 minutes. Isn't it great? Okay, right, very good. I've just come from a meeting at the Treasury. Not something I do every day. We wrote a report called "Where Did Our Money Go?" And we had a phone call from the Treasury. They phoned up and said, "Oh, this guy called up and said, would you come and meet us?" And we turned up, and we went into the room, and there were 25 people in the room. I swear they thought that we knew where our money had gone. They kind of nodded a lot as we went through. I think there's a kind of revolution brewing in the Treasury. And it also reminded me of Gordon Brown. I don't know if anybody ever saw him speak. Whenever he did kind of public meetings, he told the same joke absolutely every time. He said there's two types of chancellor: those who fail and those who get out in time. Almost uniquely, he did both. Anyway, on to BP. I'm going to start with these words, talking about, this is on a riff, a theme on hubris. And I quote, "The amount of volume of oil and dispersant we are putting into the Gulf of Mexico is tiny in relation to the total volume of water." It's the immortal words of Tony Hayward. It's a little bit like saying that the amount of cyanide I'm putting in your drink is small in comparison to the gin and tonic. And this is a theme which goes back over the last 100 years where BP is concerned. PR is not a strong point of theirs. And titter we might, but the rise and fall of BP is frighteningly and disturbingly connected to potentially our own rise and fall. And that's what I'm going to talk about in the next few minutes. But first of all, you've got to picture the early days of the oil industry. There's a reason that we count oil in terms of barrels, and that's because that's how they used to carry it around, literally in old whiskey barrels on horse and carts. That's how it all began. And BP began with a man called William Knox Darcy, who'd made a fortune gold mining in Australia and being particularly nasty to the people who lived there first. And even their official history says of Knox Darcy that he led the self-indulgent life of a rich gentleman. And he decided he got bored with gold in Australia. He was already rich, but he wanted more money. This is a theme in the oil industry in general. So he decided to go and prospect for oil in Persia. And coming back to the theme of their lack of PR skills, in 1903 he set up a company which he called, and I'm not joking, the First Exploitation Company. That's how BP began its life. And just to kind of rub it in, the only local people that they employed were mercenaries to keep angry local communities away from where they were looking for oil. And they found oil. The problem was the oil that they found was very smelly, which meant that you couldn't use it in the home. So they had to kind of look around. Now, here comes a neat editorial link with the previous talk. In steps Winston Churchill, who was First Lord of the Navy at the time, who is convinced that the British Navy should switch from using coal to using oil. He thought it would give them faster ships, that it was a more efficient way of powering the fleet. So he struck a deal with Darcy. They did a deal. And he particularly went with this new upstart company rather than the already established Shell, because Shell was foreign. Churchill thought he could not be sure of Shell. There's a cheap joke on a brand name's catchphrase. And indeed it worked. It was successful. Lord Curzon famously quipped that the Allied cause floated to victory on a wave of oil. And oil extended the boundaries of the war, both in terms of its potential. We took to the air with a new fashion for aviation, and it also increased the range of targets for the war. During World War I, Britain went and captured and took occupation of Baghdad, which left Gertrude Bell in 1921, writing home with the immortal words that oil is the trouble, of course, detestable stuff. It gets odder still, even the name British Petroleum, we have to thank a German oil company for, who took it up before the First World War because they thought it was a great way of breaking into the British market. And we expropriated that German oil company, and that's how the name got it into the family. But accidents, and the accidents that you've seen from BP recently, are not new. They go back to the early days, their first big refinery in Abadan, where there were fires and strikes that crippled it. The government had to bail them out. But BP survived, they got through that, and in the 1930s, one of the former presidents of BP, never shy of a little bit of understatement, described the achievement of the company, which had become the Anglo-Persian Oil Company, that its achievements had not, and I quote, been equaled by any other concern in the history of the world. Now, immediately after that, they got hit by the recession, their profits halved. They unilaterally changed the terms of their contract with the government in Tehran, and in so doing, sowed the seeds of lasting resentment. But war came to save BP again. There was a lot of need for oil. And their staff got involved very enthusiastically. You might even say doggy style, because they got involved in projects like the pipeline under the ocean, codename Pluto. They got involved with fog investigation dispersal operations, codename Fido. We were creative back then in those days. After the war, another former BP chief, William Fraser, another good one in the grand tradition, so fatally ruined relationships in the Middle East and fatally emboldened the UK in advance of the Suez crisis that Kenneth Younger described him as of thoroughly second-rate intelligence and personality, a man whose insensitivity had, and I'm quoting, so please don't think that I'm saying this, all the contempt of a Glasgow accountant for anything which cannot be shown on a balance sheet. Even Harold Macmillan, not someone to talk, suggested, why don't we make him a peer and be done with him? And then the British fatally underestimated the rise of a colourful nationalist in the Middle East called Mohammed Mossadegh, who looked at the deal his country had with BP and thought that BP was guilty of, his words, sheer looting, not business, a bit like the banks today. He calls for nationalisation in February 1951. There's an international boycott of Iran. Churchill, that man again, overrides his foreign secretary, Eden, who's off ill, always a mistake in politics. He approves a CIA-organised and funded coup against Mossadegh. And this is where the surreality creeps in. Dickens couldn't have made it up with his ability for naming people. This coup is overseen by an American CIA operative called Kermit Roosevelt Jr. He's the grandson of Theodore Roosevelt. The success of that coup sets the tone for American adventurism all around the world for decades after. And if you go through the BP official history, which is very big, 1,700 pages, you will find 2 sentences devoted to this critical moment of history. One of those sentences just says you can read about this elsewhere. You might think it's still a little bit sensitive for the company. A later account by Hugh Thomas of the Suez Crisis put all these desperate measures into context. He said, ever since Churchill converted the Navy to the use of oil, British politicians have seemed to have had a feeling about oil supplies comparable to the fear of castration. BP was scared. It thought it had to diversify. It increased extraction in Kuwait, Qatar, Iraq. It searched for oil in Malta, Papua New Guinea, Australia, Alaska, the Caribbean and the Rocky Mountains. They had more luck in Nigeria and, tellingly, beneath the sands of Libya. Tricky one. The glut that ensued, not just with BP, but with the other big so-called Seven Sisters, as Anthony Sampson called them, meant there's so much oil around that it was a product in search of a market. And it ended up fueling, in effect, the modern consumer society. Stuff that you never knew you needed, like hard plastic-wrapped individual apples in motorway service stations. It allowed us, literally and metaphorically, to defy gravity with the growth of the aviation industry, through the Green Revolution and high-input farming. And then BP was still on the make, obviously, and they were looking around the North Sea, and they were not finding anything in the North Sea until one of their senior executives had a bit of a hissy fit, this sort of Monty Python-esque fit of temper, because they were looking undersea in a place that was known as McNutt's Half Dome. Yeah, he thought it was silly too. So he told them to move the exploration platform, and they found the Forties Field. There was temporary euphoria until once again safety dogged their steps, and an exploration platform called the Sea Gem collapsed in a storm with mass fatalities. So what seemed like a new age, even then with the discovery of North Sea oil, was actually an age set to live fast and die young. Production peaked from the North Sea in 1999. It's now declining dramatically. In the year 2000, BP's chief executive, John Brown, declared that BP was now going to stand, famously he said this, no longer for British Petroleum, but for Beyond Petroleum. Their ad execs hunkered down and actually paid good money for newspaper advertisements that said they were going to think outside the barrel. It just hurts, even just saying that. 10 years on, generally they're more likely to be found crying at the bottom of one. Because they didn't go beyond oil. They're still very much in the thick of it. And when Tony Hayward took over from John Brown, he said another one of his carefully crafted public statements. He said that within BP he had found, and I quote, too many people working to save the world. As a consequence, 93% of their total investment fund from a couple of years ago was still focused on fossil fuels. They closed the London headquarters of BP Alternative Energy. Solar plants in the USA and Spain were closed. They pulled out of virtually all wind power outside the US. Tony Hayward also said that he would focus like a laser on safety. And then along comes Deepwater Horizon, in an area fabulously called the Macondo Prospect. You're all a literary bunch. We all know about Macondo, don't we? It was that town, imaginary in Latin America, created by Gabriel Garcia Marquez, that was, first of all, partially destroyed by the arrival of a large multinational corporation, and then blown off the map by an extreme weather event. BP's been a repeat offender. That's why it's not very popular. Texas, Alaska, the safety lapses go on and on and on. The irony of the obsession about its Britishness is that BP America actually includes Amoco, which used to be part of Standard Oil, the big one. And brilliantly, I'm a bit of a latecomer to these things. I've just been introduced to Twitter. All my colleagues told me, you have to be on Twitter. Social media, you've got to do it. I signed up. One of the first things that happened is that Twitter kept trying to encourage me to follow BP America. Every time I clocked on, it said, follow BP America. I was thinking, where do you want me to follow them to? The bottom of the Gulf of Mexico? Hell? Dante's Inferno? And the Financial Times said that BP's safety plans were, I quote, ludicrously overconfident. Now, we can't laugh because the global economy, the UK economy, is still horribly addicted to oil. Things like Deepwater Horizon were meant to be the buffer for the peak and decline of oil. They're meant to be able to sort of ease us through the period, but the safety concerns are suggesting that's not possible. We have Lloyd's of London telling us that the price of oil could be $200 a barrel by 2013. Things start to fall apart at the price we're at the moment. For BP, output is falling in a lot of their key countries, in the US, in Britain, in Russia. WikiLeaks recently came out and showed that the reserves in Saudi Arabia, long suspected to be fictionally overinflated, was indeed the case, as much less than they thought. Rip the oil drip from the economy's arm, and the choice is either economic seizure or rapid transition. £1 in 8 of all of our pensions, if anybody's actually got a pension here, depends upon the fortunes of BP. And then there's climate change. No time to go into that. We need to get out of it anyway. We've got an economy in deep, deep denial. Anthony Sampson, just to round up, Anthony Sampson said of the big oil companies, including BP, that their incomes were greater than those of most countries where they operated. Their fleets of tankers had more tonnage than any navy. They owned and administered whole cities in the desert. Now that oil age, the last century, is rapidly becoming a mirage. Oil dominates our modern energy supply, which provides the equivalent in energy terms of the work of 22 billion slaves. What is going to replace that? And the oil politics of the Middle East, as we've seen, has created a kind of slavery for populations in the Middle East, something that they are now beginning to throw off. We've got a government that's shown it has an appetite for a radical program, but I would argue a wrong and regressive and an ideological one, not a practical, necessary one to transition us out of oil. Ladies and gentlemen, I'd say that it's time that all of us stood up and broke our carbon chains so that we don't go down with BP. Thank you for listening.